We are continuing our reflections on this period of time which traditionally is called Lent, the Lenten time. And I talked a little bit about what that means and how we can reflect on this period of time. And as we enter into next week, which is what we call the Holy Week, beginning on Palm Sunday, we're going to be focusing our attention more so on those interesting events in the gospel that lead us to this pivotal point in history where the Son of God, the Son of Man, is tried, he's crucified, but yet he is risen from the dead. And this is why we're here. It has been said, and I've said this before, but it has been said, one of the Christian theologians and historians from Great Britain, N.T. Wright, I don't know if you've heard of him, but as he examined the historical setting for the rise of Christianity, he said this. He said, given what I know historically, culturally, and socially about the first century and what it meant for a person to be crucified, he said, I cannot explain, absolutely cannot explain the rapid rise of Christianity without the resurrection. Without the resurrection. It makes no sense, he says. There's no way that this little band of scared and frightened men who were hovering in that room with the doors locked could have been emboldened to stand up facing the threat of death and proclaim the risen Christ. That makes no sense unless he really rose from the dead, because they were putting their lives on the line. They were standing there as eyewitnesses. This is what we're leading up to. And this is why we're here today, because without the resurrection, this little Jesus movement would not have gone anywhere. It would have died with his death, but it didn't. Here we are today, and we're here today because he is risen. He is risen indeed, and that's what we're leading up to. But as I said earlier, I would like you, in preparation for that time, to be reading through the Gospel of Luke, chapters 20 through 24. This is the section in Scripture that brings us into the setting, to these events as they are unfolding in the Gospel. In Luke 19, of course, which we'll be celebrating next week, is the triumphal entry. But I want to highlight a few things about that and then jump to chapter 20, because I want to focus in on something. When we look at these events, even the most critical scholars, when they look at the gospel events and they examine what Jesus is saying and what he does. John Dominic Crossan, I don't know if you know who he is. He was a part of what's called the Jesus Seminar back in the 1990s, which was a group of critical scholars who were, they weren't like us, okay? They're very liberal scholars. But at least he recognizes this. What Crossan says, he says, if you look at the Gospels, you see this guy is going to die. That's what he said. The stuff that this guy is saying, the things that he's doing, he is headed for execution. He's going to die. Now, what are those things that he's doing that are going to lead to his death? What are those things? Well, socially, we can see that he's undermining the authority structure that existed at that time. He's criticizing it. He's challenging it. I mean, we don't really get, do we, what it means when he walks into the temple, and at the end of chapter 19, this is after the triumphal entry, by the way, after Palm Sunday, as we call it today. He walks into the temple, and he creates complete havoc there, essentially. He walks in there where all the money changers are, where they have their tables set up, and they're selling little doves and things, so people can offer their sacrifices. But they're also exchanging money here, because that was a part of the racket, and it was a racket that was going on. He walks in there and he kicks over their tables, makes a whip, and chases them out. Okay? I don't think we get how radical that was. I don't think we understand where that placed him in relation to the temple authority. It just confirmed to them that they needed to get rid of this guy. And this happened the week of his crucifixion. You can see it was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. It's going to take him there. He's going to get there real fast now. You know, that's what's going to happen. And that's what John Dominic Crossan recognizes. He says, this guy's going to die. Anybody who did this kind of thing in the first century is going to end up being killed somehow. And that's what we're looking at here. But even though that's true, we need to recognize that the most significant thing about Jesus' ministry is the fact that he constantly identified himself through various ways as the prophesied Messiah, the Son of God. See, and that probably got him in more trouble than anything else with the religious leaders. I'd like us to take a look at something very interesting. Now, we're going to look at this next week in a little more detail, but when Jesus came into Jerusalem the week before, Palm Sunday, something interesting happens. He makes his most obvious claim by virtue of the Messiah, by virtue of what he does, more than anything else. And that is a fulfillment of a prophecy that we find in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Let me read to you that. It says this, "Rejoice, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." That's what he does. He rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, if that's not an expression of his identity, I don't know what else could be. He's demonstrating who he is by how he acts, by what he does. Do you recognize me? As he rides in a donkey, that's what he's saying. Do you see who I am? I'm the one that Zechariah talked about. I'm the one that Daniel talked about. I'm the one that Isaiah talked about. Can you see by what I do, by what I say, who I am? I read from Psalm 118 a moment ago as our call to worship. And in Psalm 118, we have another description of a messianic king who's described as having conquered his enemies and then enters the gates of Jerusalem as a conqueror. And what is it that the people say? What are they doing? They're waving boughs in a procession all the way up to the temple. They're doing this in this description in Psalm 118. And this is what they proclaim: "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." What is it that they say on Palm Sunday when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? That phrase, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." I have more to say about that next week because we'll see how the religious leaders respond to that. But that is exactly what happens in Luke 19 when he comes into Jerusalem in that triumphal entry. The people see Jesus as the king who has come to defeat his enemies, and they honor him as that one that is proclaimed in Psalm 118. So in this week, as I mentioned earlier, during this last week, he has thrown down the gauntlet. Jesus has done that. He's boldly declared himself as the Messiah. Remember, up until this point in the Gospels, he sort of hints at it. It's sort of clandestine in a certain way. He doesn't come right out and say it, but he does portray himself slowly and subtly as the Messiah, but he doesn't do it all at once. In fact, when people are healed or people recognize who he is, he says, "Keep that to yourself." Keep that to yourself. My time has not yet come, you see. But here, this is in these weeks that we're celebrating now, this is when he comes out boldly, and he's coming out in strong ways because he knows this is the time that this is supposed to take place. So Jesus is directly standing up against the temple authority. He's calling them out, and they don't like it. They want to kill him. They want to kill him not only because he's standing against their system, but they also see him as a threat to their relationship with the Romans. That's something we don't necessarily know, without looking at it closely. But they had a relationship with the Romans. There was a quid pro quo situation going on there, and for any Orthodox Jew, this should have been recognized as something that you simply don't do. But they were nonetheless doing it, and they were worried that Jesus's popularity was going to create or start an uprising against the Romans. Because after all, who were the Jewish people looking for? A Messiah who would deliver them through military conquest from the Romans. Because that's how it had been in the past. That's how God had delivered them in the past. But this was going to be different. This was going to be different. They weren't expecting a dying Messiah. They weren't expecting that at all. So Jesus is nonetheless continuing to portray himself in an absolutely brilliant way by attaching himself to Old Testament prophecies. It's just incredibly fascinating when we look at this. I read from Psalm 118 this verse. It says this: "The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." You've heard that passage before, haven't you? It's in the New Testament, but it actually comes from this psalm, from Psalm 118:22. And what's interesting about this is that there's a word play going on. I love it when scriptures do these sorts of things. There's something else going on here. It's not just one thing. There's more than one thing happening. It's really cool when you dig down and you see these things. The wordplay involved in saying that the stone has become the cornerstone. Remember, that's what it says. The stone builders rejected. What the stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Okay? Now that word cornerstone, there's a word play with that. The word pinna, or cornerstone, in Hebrew is also used to describe one who is a leader. It's also used to describe someone who is a leader. And in fact, several places in the Old Testament, we have that word being used, cornerstone, to sort of poetically describe leaders. We have one in Judges chapter 20 and Isaiah 19. I'm not going to look at those, but you can look them up later if you're interested. Judges 20, verse 2, Isaiah 19, 13. And in Psalm 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone is a description of the triumphant king who God has given the victory over his enemies. So not only is he a cornerstone, that is to say a king, a leader, he is the chief cornerstone, which is another way of saying what it says elsewhere in the Bible, King of Kings. To be the chief cornerstone is like saying he's the King of Kings. He's the leader of all leaders, you see. Isn't that cool how God inspired the biblical authors to do this, to put a word in there that could be taken in a couple different ways? Well, that's what's going on here. And so Jesus makes a pretty bold claim when he expands upon this claim of being the cornerstone. He says in Luke chapter 20, verse 18, that's how he puts it, "Everyone who stumbles on the stone will be broken, and he on whom it falls will be crushed." Now that sounds a little, clandestine, does it? What's he mean by this? Everyone who stumbles on the stone will be broken, and he on whom it falls will be crushed. Some translations say crushed into dust or something like that. It's pretty serious business, isn't it? But what's on the face of it? It says that no one wins who comes up against the stone. That's what it sounds like, doesn't it? But I think there's something more important going on here. Namely, that Jesus was combining the two extremely powerful statements from the scriptures to say something greater than that. And in fact, in Isaiah chapter 8, this is part of what he's getting at. It says this, 8 verses 13 through 14. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy for both houses of Israel. Now listen to this. He will be a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. Okay, here we have that imagery again. He will be a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. Now what's he getting at here? This passage, I think, is the background to what Jesus says in Luke chapter 20. It's the background, at least of the first part of that statement, the one that says, everyone who stumbles on the stone will be broken. Now, what's it speaking about? Well, in the prophetic sense, it's talking about the judgment that's going to come on Israel, where the Lord can be either two things, one of two things. He can either be a sanctuary, or he can be the stone that will turn them into rubble. Okay? And this, as true as this was back then, it's true for us today. Now, the Lord is either going to be your sanctuary, your place of refuge, your place where you find peace, the place where you find salvation, protection. He's either going to be that, a sanctuary, or he's going to be a stone that will crush you, that will pulverize you. You see, those are the two ways that it works. And for those who lived in the first century, this choice was dependent upon whether they believed in him or not. It's that simple. Whether you believed him or not, that would determine the outcome of whether he was your sanctuary or whether he was the thing that would crush you. But what's interesting about this is the second part. And by the way, you know that that's exactly how it works out in the first century. Those who receive him are saved as a result of that from the judgment, the wrath that comes upon the house of Israel. And that, of course, occurs in AD 70, when the Romans come in. And if you read Matthew 24, you see that Jesus talks about that period of time that was coming. He says it's going to happen within this generation, he says, is going to happen. There are some standing here today that will see these things fulfilled. He tells them that. So we know that that's what he's talking about. He's talking about this judgment that's coming on the house of Israel because they have rejected the stone. And so that stone's going to come and crush them. And that's exactly what happened in AD 70. But he also says that those days are going to be shortened for the sake of the elect. In other words, those who God has saved out from under that judgment, he shortens that period of judgment to save them, to preserve them. That's the sanctuary that he's talking about. And those people, of course, are those who have received Christ. You see, they have received that stone. They did not fight against it. They did not go against it. But the second part of Luke 20, verse 18, is where it says, when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. And this is imagery also from the Old Testament. Maybe some of you are already thinking, I think I know where this comes from. And you're probably right. This comes from a vision that Daniel gets in Daniel chapter 2. Actually, it was King Nebuchadnezzar's vision, but Daniel is the one who interprets it. Remember, Daniel is a prophet. He's an interpreter of the dreams. He's one of the young men who was taken away into captivity to Babylon, during that exile, that period of exile. And King Nebuchadnezzar has this vision of a statue, and the statue has a gold head, a silver chest, bronze legs, and iron and feet and clay feet. Okay, a mixture of iron and clay for the feet. And what he sees is a rock that is cut out. this rock that is cut out, and it says in Daniel's interpretation, not by human hands. So it's not carved out by human hands. In other words, it doesn't come from human beings, which implies what? It comes from God. Okay? And what this rock does that is cut out, it strikes the statue on its feet and crushes it, completely pulverizes it, you see. And the statue falls to pieces, but the rock itself becomes a huge mountain, and it fills the whole earth. It's a huge mountain that fills the whole earth. And Daniel explains to King Nebuchadnezzar that the parts of the statue represent kingdoms, beginning with his own kingdom. That's the head of gold. And the feet of iron and clay represents the Roman Empire of Jesus' day. So this is a foreseeing of future kingdoms, you see. And in Daniel 2:44, it says this, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. It will itself endure forever. You and I are inheritors of that kingdom. That's exactly what happened. Those kingdoms that preceded the coming of the Messiah and the one that existed at the time, they all collapsed. They all fell. The power structure of those kingdoms was destroyed. It was destroyed, as I said earlier, because God, through Christ, created a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and it crushed them all. You and I are part of that kingdom. Now, right now, I would imagine that you're thinking, well, it seems like we are in decline. The church is in decline. Christianity is in decline, and so on. Well, guess what? It's not the first time it's happened. It's not the first time that it seemed that way. There's a book that I just ordered. I'm looking forward to reading it. That is titled "How Christianity Saved Civilization and Will Do It Again." Okay, the author of the textbook is a historian. You know how many times he documents the church saving civilization throughout the last 2,000 years? 12 times. 12 times. A society has collapsed. Guess who came in to pick up the pieces and reestablish it? It was the church. It was the church. Should we be surprised when we see a decline in the church today and we see the corruption that is rising up all around us, the immoral decadence that was just recently displayed on that ridiculous Hollywood stuff that is talked about so much in the news media today? Should we be surprised by that? No. Kingdoms rise and they fall, but one thing goes on, and that is the kingdom that Christ established. And we, as the church, need to be ready to pick up the pieces when it collapses. What that means is that we need to remember and be faithful and loyal to our King, because his kingdom endures forever. And despite what it looks like going on around us, we need to have hope. We need to have hope. Having hope is extremely important for us in recognizing and encouraging ourselves and one another that no matter what happens, we have a responsibility. And that even when it seems like we're doing stuff that doesn't benefit, that doesn't produce fruit, we may not see the fruit, but it will come. It will come. God will work through it and bring it about. Of course, in our text, in the Gospels, the reference that Daniel makes to this rock that crushes all those kingdoms and brings them to an end, but itself endures forever, is the coming messianic kingdom, the one that we are a part of. We have this imagery of a rock that's cut out not with human hands. Have you seen that before in the Old Testament? Yeah. How about the Ten Commandments? Who cut that out? God did. Who wrote that out? Moses? No, God did. You see, whenever this image of a rock is used, it symbolizes permanence. Because, other things rot, decay. Rocks have this idea of permanence. And so here we see a kingdom that is permanent. So this picture of a rock that crushes is a reference to the second half of that saying of Jesus, he on whom it falls will be crushed. You see, if you try to stand against this kingdom, it will crush you. It will crush you. And so Jesus, when he's tying these two things together, all surrounding this idea of a stone, he's pointing out that he is that stone that's referenced in Isaiah 8. He is either a savior to you or a stumbling block to Israel at the time that this was taking place, obviously. And it depends on whether they would choose to believe him or not. And the same is true for us today. Whether we choose to believe him or not, that's going to be what determines whether he is a sanctuary, a savior to you, or a stone that crushes you. There's no reason to wonder why people think, Christians are weird and crazy, right? There's no reason to think that. It's obvious. They are doomed to be crushed. And that's what blind people can't see. Blind people can't figure this thing out. They can't see it. And until they humble by the Holy Spirit working in their hearts, they are humbled and their eyes are opened, they will continue to be in the dark. They won't be able to see and understand this. But you and I do see it. We do understand it. And we must remain faithful to that, regardless of what it looks like around us. As bad as we think it is, it could not, I don't think it even compares to how bad it was in the first century to these men and women who were followers of Jesus. Their lives were literally threatened all the time. But they stayed firm and they were faithful to the end. So my challenge to you this morning is, as you think about and read chapters 20 through 24 in Luke, remember that we are the ones who have accepted this rock as a sanctuary. And because of that, we can always count on God's sovereign hand guiding us and working out his plan, because he's promised that his kingdom will never end. That's the kingdom that we belong to, the kingdom of which we are a part. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope that's exciting to you, because even though this is a solemn time on our calendars, the Passion Week, the Holy Week coming up, it is nonetheless a time of rejoicing, a time to be glad, because it's the day that the Lord has made. Nothing could be worse than thinking that you won when you've actually lost. Don't you think? That's what the world thinks. That's what those people thought when they got Jesus arrested and had him crucified. They thought they won, but they had lost. The world thinks that they're winning. They think we're the losers and they're the winners. And it's the opposite. They don't even know that they've lost. We are the winners because of Christ. Not because of anything we've done, but because of what he has done. You see. Isn't that great news? I hope that you'll carry that with you through the week and the rest of your lives. Anyway, I want you to have a great week, and God go with you, and I look forward to seeing you on Palm Sunday, if not before. Take care. Have a great week.